In the early hours of the 30th of October 2017, the container vessel Eversmart experienced heavy weather and suffered a container stack collapse while on passage between Taipei and Los Angeles. The thing is, the crew did the right thing, changing course to avoid the worst of the weather and keeping the movement of the ship well within accepted parameters. Despite that, they still lost 42 containers overboard with 34 others damaged. So, what happened? In late October 2017, in the port of Taipei, Eversmart was alongside loading containers in preparation for her upcoming voyage to the United States. She was a 300-metre long container vessel with a capacity for 7,024 20-foot containers. She had 18 bays from bow to stern, where each bay could take either two 20-foot containers or one 40-foot. To secure containers above the deck, there were lashing bridges which allowed the direct lashing of the 4th and 5th tiers above deck and a total stack height of up to 9 containers. Anyway, she completed loading at around 3:42 in the morning of the 26th of October and departed the berth half an hour later at 4:12. Once clear of the harbour, the pilot disembarked and Eversmart set off on a great circle track across the Pacific Ocean towards the port of Los Angeles, where she was due to arrive at 4 o'clock in the morning on the 8th of November 2017. A great circle is the shortest way to travel between 2 points on the surface of a sphere. Due to the flat projection of the chart though, it actually looks like a curved line, despite being physically the shortest route. In our case, the Great Circle route was just over 6,000 nautical miles, so the crew set the ship's speed at 18.2 knots to make landfall on time. Throughout the first day, they made good speed, so dropped the engine a little to maintain the right ETA. On the morning of the 27th, the master, who had been watching a couple of developing depressions, requested a routing assessment from the ship's weather routing provider. They advised a more southerly route to avoid the worst of the weather, so the officer of the watch amended the ship's passage plan, and they altered course at 14:45. Throughout the next 24 hours, the weather continued to worsen. The strength of the southeasterly winds had increased to force 8, and Eversmart was pitching and rolling more heavily. The master ordered weather-tight and watertight doors to be closed and all loose items to be secured before confining the crew to the safety of the accommodation block. The ship continued rolling 10-12 degrees from side to side and pitching heavily. Every 10 to 15 minutes, she must have encountered a bigger wave as she shuddered with strong vibrations, no doubt caused by the flare of the bow pounding. In the early hours of the following morning, so the 30th of October, the pitching and shuddering had increased to such an extent that the master went to the bridge. Around the same time, a crew member awake in his cabin heard an unusual crashing and banging from the aft end of the ship. On the bridge, the master observed that the wind had veered around to the south, putting it on the starboard beam. The swell continued from right ahead though, meaning Eversmart was still pounding. To reduce it, the master decided to drop the speed further. As night turned to day, the strength of the wind slowly dropped and conditions gradually improved. By late afternoon, the captain was happy to lift the heavy weather restrictions so the crew could go and check the cargo. They soon discovered that Stack 70 at the aft end of the ship had collapsed. The entire bay had toppled over to port with over 40 containers gone completely. Fortunately, the structure of the ship itself showed no significant damage, so they were able to continue on to Los Angeles, where they arrived on the 8th of November. Inspectors could then board and start to get to the bottom of what happened. Looking at the bay in question, they could see that the stack had fallen over towards the port side, indicating that it was probably the starboard stacks that gave way first and initiated a domino effect across the bay. On closer inspection, the container at the bottom of the stack on the starboard side showed signs of collapse. For whatever reason, the port side of this container gave way, allowing the entire stack to topple over, taking out the whole bay. Was it a structural issue with the container itself? Well, probably not. The container had passed numerous inspections during its service life, and the declared stack weight above was well within its design parameters. Of course, familiar viewers will already know about the issue of misdeclared container weights though, so naturally, that was the next thing we checked. Across the entire bay, 68 of the remaining containers were within 5% of their declared weight. 23 were 5 or 10% out, 12 were 10 to 20% out, 1 was 20 to 30% out, 2 of them were 30 to 40% off, and 1 was over 50% out. On average though, across the entire bay, the declared weights and the actual weights were almost spot on. So, structural collapse due to static loading is unlikely, but what about dynamic loads? After all, the ship was in heavy weather. Remember, each time the bow slammed into a wave, the crew reported tremors running through the ship. Ships aren't solid, they bend and flex with the motion of the ocean. When a flared bow slams into a wave, it will send shockwaves through the hull, in the same way that a ruler vibrates when you ping it off a table. The greatest movement will be experienced at the ends of the ship, right where the stack collapsed. We might be getting somewhere, but remember, the weight of the starboard stack was significantly below the load limits of the container, so even violent vibrations should have been okay. There must be more to it, so let's take a look at the distribution of those weights in a little more detail. Starting with the loading guidance and a stack weight table for the bay, we can see that the correct loading configuration is for heavier containers to be placed lower down than lighter containers. That makes sense, as it keeps the centre of gravity of each stack as low as possible. In addition to that, we can see that the stacks on each side have lower limits than those in the middle. That's because the forces felt due to the movement of the vessel are greatest at the edges. If I now highlight all the containers with a weight greater than their recommended weight, we can see that the Ever Smart was actually loaded incorrectly. Focusing just on this stack, we can see that the containers at the top all weighed too much, while the containers at the bottom were well below their weight limit. The overall weight was fine, but the centre of gravity of the stack was way too high. What this does is increase the forces acting on the bottom of the stack when the ship moves, simply because there's a bigger moment. It increases the stresses, not only on the containers themselves, but also on the lashing arrangements. Remember, those fixings securing the containers to the deck. In terms of the fixings themselves, obviously those came apart when the stacks collapsed, so it was impossible to check them. What the inspectors could do, however, was to check the securing arrangements of the containers in other bays. The containers in the rows above the securing bridges should have all been locked down tightly with lashing rods, and the outer columns should have additional wind lashings to help resist the lateral forces due to a beam wind. They found that a lot of the lashing rods were loose, and the wind lashings on containers after the bridge were missing entirely. It turns out that the containers after the bridge were what's known as high cubes, meaning they were 9'6" rather than 8'6" in height. This meant that they were taller than usual and that the lashings might not have been long enough to apply correctly. We might now be onto something. It looks like the stowage plan was incorrect, allocating too much weight high up in the stacks, and those stacks were not secured correctly. As the weather got worse and the bows started pounding, vibrations through the ship applied a great deal of force to the lashings on the aftermost stack. Then, as the ship continued through the storm and the wind shifted onto the starboard beam, the additional height from the high cubes resulted in wind forces above tolerance, especially for a stack that was lacking suitable fixings. The container at the bottom of the starboard stack collapsed, initiating a domino effect across all the stacks in the aftermost bay. Containers on the port side had nothing more to fall against, so simply went overboard. Of course, this is just the most likely series of events. As always, we can never know for certain what really happened. If you would like more information about this incident, this video is actually based on a real MAIB report published under Crown copyright and linked down below. I'd definitely recommend you go and check it out.